Hello, so I thought I'd make this short video just to showcase some of the miniatures which are available in the 25 and 28mm ranges for the Plains Indian Wars. Now, a lot of the manufacturers don't show the miniatures on their websites, so sometimes you have to buy them blind. Especially in the UK, for example, Old Glory Miniatures, they don't show their range on the UK website, but on the US site they do. Not that the pictures there are all that detailed. So we're just going to go through 6 of the main manufacturers for the Plains Indian Wars range, and just to have a look at them and perhaps compare some of the miniatures. So we're going to start off with Old Glory, who've got quite a large range. And this is one of their 7th Cavalry miniatures. And this one's, I'm not showcasing really the painting on these. I paint them to a kind of basic wargame standard. Now, as you can see, this one's a little bit kind of Hollywood version. He's wearing his gauntlets along with a short sleeve shirt, and he's kit kind of looks pretty much like it would in the films of the 1960s and so on. You could almost imagine him being painted with a red fireman's shirt rather than a grey one. And some of the miniatures in each of the ranges do have figures which are very much taken from the films of the 1960s and so on. But I think Old Glory have kind of a mix of both. And here we have a casualty, and this one's a little bit more historically accurate. Doesn't have the spurs on his boots, but that's really a kind of small detail. You can see the facial detail on some of these figures isn't really brilliant. Doesn't really matter with that one because he's a casualty. But they do have a decent range of different figures with the Old Glory miniatures. Here's another casualty here. This one was actually being a figure meant to be being shot, but I cut the base off to make him one that's already kind of fallen, which seemed to be a bit more useful. That one does have he's got a little bit of a better face on him. It's a decent enough figure. And they have a great last stand set in the Old Glory range, of which this is one. It's not painted yet, but it's a guy which is slumped over his horse. And in this particular set, I think they also have a guy that's shooting himself in the head, which is a pretty unique figure. I'm not sure what use it is, but it may be good for dioramas. But they have a lot of these dead horses and casualty figures, which are kind of useful, especially for the Wargames rules set, which I made myself, which I'm using these for, which relies a lot on casualty figures and that kind of thing to display on the field. And this is one of the Plains Indians. Well, this guy actually has come in 2 halves, so you can make a few variants on the models. In this case, you can mix and match different tops and bottoms to them, which is quite good. And with these ones you get 30 in a pack, which costs I think it's about £30 or about $45 US. So they're pretty much the cheapest figures you can get, and some of them the face detail is pretty good. So I think these are some of my favourites. And one of the only ranges as well to do non-combatants. Actually, this wasn't a very good one to pick up. It's got a bit of milliput stuck in her face, this one. That's a pretty good miniature. And this is something that a lot of the manufacturers do, and that is to give the guys swords, which I don't really like because I mainly use my figures for the Little Bighorn kind of period, and of course the 7th Cavalry didn't have sabres at that time, but a lot of the manufacturers which even make miniatures specifically for the Battle of Little Bighorn make the mistake of putting sabres on the figures. For example, Foundry, I think they're Lieutenant Derudio and the Sergeant, they both have swords, but none of the other miniatures do. But it's just 1 or 2 you can kind of let it slide. But again, it's a very good miniature there. And this is another one of the Plains Indians where you can see that the body there is in the two halves. We also have a selection of shields that come on them, which you can stick on. So no two miniatures need to be the same. I don't like duplicates of miniatures, and I try to make all my miniatures look different. So this kind of thing is particularly welcome. And that's about all I'll show for the Old Glory miniatures. There's a bit of range of different miniatures on those. And then we'll move on to Britannia miniatures. Now these ones are a little bit bigger, and they look a little bit more cartoony, and the details a little bit less. I'm going to just compare the size on a couple of the miniatures here. So that's a Britannia miniature there, and we have next to it, that's one of the Old Glory miniatures. So you can see there's a little bit of size difference there. Size difference doesn't matter too much. The gauntlets are pretty big on these, adding to the cartoony quality, and the faces are pretty big looking, but I don't mind them. I think they look kind of cool. This is an unpainted one, guy leading his horse. This is the only range as well, I think, which do horse holders. Actually, they do a mounted horse holder. It only comes in the one pose. And I've ordered a few of them, but they didn't have any head variants between them, so I don't know if they do head variants on the horse holders. It'd be nice if they do, but I've not seen it. And this is one of their casualties, and again, it's I've not based this one because I need to get a bigger base for them, because he's kind of a bit bigger than the other miniatures, so he's going to need a bigger base. This is a Crow Scout, and I think he looks pretty good. Again, although their faces are quite big, I think that kind of suits the miniature. One of the things, though, I don't like about these particular miniatures is that the figures are big, but the horses tend to be smaller than most of the others. So a lot of them, particularly the native warriors, tend to look like they're riding kind of miniature Dartmoor ponies or something, because the figures are quite big on their mounts. But they're good miniatures. Then we'll move on to Foundry. These are some of the more detailed miniatures in the range. It's one of their 7th Cavalry Troopers. So it's pretty authentic kit on that particular guy, and pretty much on scale with all the other miniatures except for the Britannia ones, which I say are a little bit bigger. And this one's meant to be a Cheyenne dog soldier, but hasn't kind of quite got the right headdress for that, but it's a decent enough miniature. They're very detailed, and the faces are very good on those. One of the mounted warriors. Again, I think the faces are the best part on a lot of these miniatures, particularly the Foundry miniatures. A lot of them have very good faces, but some of them, which are character models, like this one, which is supposed to be Charlie Reynolds, one of the scouts, don't really feel he looks a lot like the portraits of the character. If you see any of the old black and white photos of him, he looks a lot tidier than this guy. Of course, he might have cleaned himself up a bit for his portrait, but doesn't really look a lot like the guy I think that he's meant to portray. Also, actually, the Captain Benteen figure. You can see that he's an officer. Doesn't really look much like any of the portraits of Captain Benteen, or Colonel Benteen if you prefer. It doesn't really look much like him, I don't think. One of the better models in the range. So one of the good things that Foundry and a lot of the manufacturers do is they'll do a version of the model on foot, and a version of him mounted. Now this guy did have the coup stick in his hand mounted as well, but this one kind of broke off, and I have a couple of him as well, so I decided to just kind of take it out of his hand and just have him have the raised fist. But it's pretty good. You can get the same guy mounted and on foot, and they have quite a decent range of figures as well. But with the Foundry miniatures, unfortunately, a lot of them they've taken out of circulation. About probably more than a quarter of the range you can no longer get, which is a bit of a shame, but maybe they'll bring them back a little bit later. Then we'll move on to Artizan Designs. Now, they don't do any Plains Indians, but they do some, I think they do 12 mounted and 12 foot US cavalry. They do Apaches and other things as well. These guys look quite a lot like the Artizan Designs, sorry, the Foundry figures, and they're pretty much perfectly on scale with them. And if I didn't know which ones were which, I think it would be kind of hard to tell, because they're pretty similarly sculpted. They're pretty good miniatures, and again they have corresponding guys mounted for foot, so that's always good if you're doing a skirmish game, so you can have the guy mounted and then dismounted as well, so that always helps. And then we have North Star miniatures. Didn't paint these myself, got these off of eBay. I think these are hard to get, and I think they're out of print. The boots are kind of a little bit high on them. Details not quite so good, but they're decent figures. They only have, I think it's the 7 different miniatures, more of a Wild West range rather than specifically Plains Indian Wars, but they're okay. They pad out your units. It looks pretty much authentic. So yeah, they're not too bad. And then we have last but not least the Dixon miniatures, of which there's quite a large range. These are one of the ones where they don't show the miniatures on the website catalogue, or most of them they don't show anyway. This is a cavalry sergeant. They're a little bit smaller than, say, the Foundry figures, just very slightly. But even in the Dixon range, some of the miniatures are a little bit bigger than others. Like this guy here is a tiny bit bigger, but he was actually it's kind of like a Civil War era figure. This guy, I think, kind of looks like, well, not just because he's got the kepi. His tunic is, oh, actually no, it's decent enough length, but yeah, a lot of their figures I think are taken over from the Civil War range, just because they look a little bit bigger, and I've ordered some figures for them which were listed as Plains Wars, and they've had kind of like long frock coats, and you know, they look like they're Civil War figures more than Plains Indian Wars. But this is actually, maybe you can see a size difference on these two, both from Dixon. They're pretty good figures. They're not the best detailed amongst the bunch, but I think they're pretty good, and they're a little bit cheaper than the Foundry ones, which are kind of the most expensive of the range. This is one of their Plains Indians. The face on this guy is not very good, but I think they're about 2/3 the price of the Foundry figures. And they do have some head variants on these as well, so you don't always get the same miniature if you buy multiples of the same one, which is just handy. It's a little bit of potluck though. But yeah, so that's the 6 main manufacturers which you can get. I think there are 1 or 2 more out there, but these are the only ones which I've picked up so far. I mean, it's easy to gravitate towards the Foundry figures because they're such good sculpts, but I think they've all got their merits. The Artizan design figures are good as well. Britannia are quite unique, and the Old Glory miniatures are the cheapest, and they have a really good range of figures as well. So there, that's the Plains Indian Wars figures.